Well, Ron DeSantis, the high-profile Republican governor of the US state of Florida and the only contender who might be popular enough to seriously challenge Donald Trump for nomination as the Republican candidate for next year's US presidential election, has released a new book and has been travelling around America promoting it with a series of speeches this past few weeks. One of the most notable events was a speech at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in the very Democrat US state of California. Governor DeSantis invoked the memory of President Reagan and his commitment to small government and warnings about letting government become too big in a country.
And President Reagan understood this. His famous quote that the most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help." He understood the vital role that government had to play. He didn't say no government, and he understood that there was core functions of government. But he also understood how government could be a negative force if not applied properly.
Probably not something you'd ever hear an Australian politician say, Labor or Liberal. But the US is different. There you can compare directly what happens when you have states run by big government, socialist-leaning parties and those governed by small government, classical, free market-leaning parties.
We have had a great experiment, a great test in governing philosophies, because of course, you know, we approach things much differently in Florida than you guys have out here, much differently in Florida than they've done in New York and in Illinois and many of these other states. And what has the result of that been? You know, you have elections in your state, and that's fine, but the American people as a whole in some ways have voted about this experiment because they voted with their feet. And if you look over the last 4 years, we've witnessed a great American exodus from states governed by leftist politicians, imposing leftist ideology and delivering poor results. And you've seen massive gains in states like Florida, who are governing according to the tried and true principles that President Reagan held dear.
At this point, I'd like to remind everyone that interstate migration from Victoria to Queensland is continuing at a pace of around about 20 to 30,000 people a year, although the Bureau of Statistics data on this is a little bit out of date, I might add. The last time the Bureau got its act together on these numbers was about 2 years ago.
And unemployment in the state of Florida, the December numbers, we were 2.7%. New York and California were 4.1%. We have significantly more people employed than we did prior to COVID, and states like New York still haven't recovered. And for the first time in recorded history, the state of Florida has more total people employed than the state of New York. And that's saying something because we got a lot of retired people in the state of Florida. So those results speak for themselves. But you know, we've always had lower taxes in Florida. That's nothing new. We've never had an income tax, and we've always worked to keep government small. So that in and of itself, while it contributes, that is not the only reason why people have moved. I think the pandemic caused people to reevaluate who was in charge of their state governments more than any other event in my lifetime.
Throughout 2021 on this podcast, I strongly criticised Australian state and federal governments for taking a single advisor approach to crisis management throughout COVID. We saw premiers like McGowan, Palaszczuk and Andrews effectively handing over responsibility for the management of their states to health bureaucrats. And that, as we pointed out at the time, is an abdication of responsibility, and it goes against every crisis management rule in the book. A leader's job is to collect information from everyone and own the final decision. You can't run a health crisis that affects the economy, civil liberties, human rights, and people's jobs and small businesses just by listening to the epidemiologists alone. Otherwise, you might end up seriously harming more people later from the unintended consequences of lockdowns and mandates than the virus itself could have harmed. It was grossly irresponsible. In America, Ron DeSantis, as governor of Florida, the equivalent of an Australian state premier, is famous for not going with the trend of taking the health advice as supreme, and instead listening to all advisors, putting the health advice right at the top, but listening to everybody and carefully considering all the possible unintended consequences.